So let's talk about the coronavirus crisis and the economic crisis that is really an inevitable result of the coronavirus situation and the geopolitical effects of this whole thing. Um, Major economists in the German government have been saying that Germany is inevitably going to go through a recession. But because Germany is the biggest economy in the EU, Germany is not going to be the most devastated by this dire situation. The countries that are going to be hit the hardest are going to be the southern European countries, Greece, Italy, and Spain, because these countries never really fully recovered from the crisis that hit the EU in late 2009. So these countries are perpetual debt slaves to the German bankers, to the European Central Bank, and they are going to be further harmed by this coronavirus crisis, economically speaking, because they never recovered and because they're right now begging for money from the European Union. And the Germanic countries, they're saying that, hey, we have no problem with giving you loans. We have no problem with getting you guys deeper into debt. But we don't want to shoulder that debt. We don't want any what they call mutualized debt. Basically saying, we'll give you a loan, but we don't want to help you pay your debt. We don't mind putting you further into debt, but we don't want to share that debt. And so they don't want mutualized debt. They don't want to have to pay money into into relieving these countries of debt. And so what is this going to do? It's very, very obvious what this is going to do. It is going to increase anti-EU sentiment. Right now, Italy's premier, Giuseppe Conte, is begging the EU for bailout money, but the Germanic countries are saying, "Nein, we are not going to help you. We don't mind giving you loans, but we are not going to share your debt." And so this is going to intensify anti-EU sentiment. When I was in Italy in late 2019, pretty much everyone I met, with the exception of one person, hated the EU, hated the immigration policy of the European Union. So the hatred is there, and it's only going to intensify. It's only going to increase because countries like Italy are going to be they're going to be entrenched further into economic diminishment, and they just went through a terrible, or they're still going through a terrible virus situation in which tens of thousands of people died. And so the psychological effects, the economic effects are going to be very, very depressing and very diminishing. And so that whole situation, that type of situation, is going to create an atmosphere of political radicalization and hatred for the establishment. And you are going to see more and more Italians talking about establishing, pure Italian sovereignty. Why are we enslaving ourselves to the bankers? Why are we enslaving ourselves to the foreigners over there in the EU, over there in the north? And so it's going to increase this polarization between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. And so the hatred is very real, and it's only going to get worse. Now, the situation today with the economic crisis that is being caused by the coronavirus crisis, it's actually eerily similar to what took place in the economic crisis that hit the EU in late 2009. And really got more devastating for Southern European countries in the following years, with the European Central Bank further putting these countries into debt slavery and pressuring them to take more bailout money, and not really caring that they were putting these countries in perpetual debt, and really rejecting any sort of serious strategy that would relieve these countries from debt slavery. I know this because I've been reading the account of a former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, and I'm reading his book right now, Adults in the Room, which is a very detailed account of how he was trying to relieve Greece from debt slavery. And one of the things that he proposed was that that the debt of the Greek banks and the debt of the Greek government be separated, because they were being treated as the same thing. And this was making Greek economic advancement really impossible, because if the banks are in debt and completely insolvent, and the Greek government is in debt and completely insolvent and enslaved to German and French banks, then there was no way for investment to get into Greece, because investment happens through the banks. The banks loan money to businesses. These businesses invest in Greece, and that makes things much better, and it helps the economy to thrive ultimately. And so this sort of thing really wasn't happening because the Greek banks were in debt and the Greek government was in debt. So in order to help the Greek government and ultimately Greek society advance economically, the Greek banks needed to be relieved, but not through bailout money, which would only lead the country further into debt, but by encouraging massive amounts of investment into the Greek banks. Varoufakis proposed the idea of allowing EU citizens to become shareholders of the Greek banks, thereby putting tremendous amounts of investment money in the Greek banks, and that would lead to the Greek banks giving away a lot of loans to investors and to businesses, and that would ultimately have a healthy ripple effect in the economy overall, because more investment means more money and more economic movement, and that is what an economy thrives upon. This strategy, this proposal of Yanis Varoufakis was viciously rejected by the European Union. The inevitable political effects of this was increasing anti-EU sentiment in Greece, to the point that the conservative government in Greece actually entertained the idea of making a coalition with Greece's Nazi party, the Golden Dawn. And this is how intense anti-EU sentiment was, to the point where Greek conservatives were actually thinking about making an alliance with Nazis. Now, this is not really surprising, because a very similar thing happened in the 20th century in Italy, in which Italy's conservatives made a coalition with the fascists and empowered Mussolini, and Italy's royalty empowered Mussolini and really put him in power. The Italian conservatives, people who thought that they were good Catholics, people who were so fixated on fighting the left to the point that they backed fascists, they ultimately empowered Mussolini and put him in the government. So it's a very, very volatile and dangerous situation that we are seeing in Europe, because the Germanic countries aren't going to help Italy. They're not going to help the Southern European countries. And these Southern European countries are going to be so devastated by the whole quagmire of it all, that they are going to become more anti-EU. And also the fact that when Italy was the worst country, was in the worst situation of the coronavirus crisis, the European Union really didn't help Italy. And it did not help Italy to the point where Italy had to rely upon China to receive medical supplies. And so the anti-EU sentiment in the midst of this coronavirus situation, in light of the coronavirus crisis, the anti-EU sentiment is very real and it's very high. Now imagine when the European Union refuses to shoulder the debt of Italy and refuses to give corona bonds to Italy and just wants to put Italy further into debt. Imagine the geopolitical effects of this. You are going to see an increase in radicalism, in radical ideology. People are going to turn to either radical left-wing ideology, and they're also going to turn to radical nationalist ideology. One of the things that Varoufakis notes is that during the economic crisis in the European Union, he saw radical anarchists and radical right-wing libertarians allying under the idea of their hatred towards the banks and also towards big government. And so if the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009 and 2010, 2011, 2012 saw the rise in movements like Occupy Wall Street and also the rise in Catalonian separatism and in Nazi entities like the Golden Dawn, imagine what we are going to see due to the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 crisis. We are going to see an intensification of political radicalism, and we are going to see an increase in popularity for radicalism, especially anti-establishment radicalism, and this is going to involve both left-wing fanatics and right-wing fanatics. So this is really something that we should expect to see, and it's not just going to be in Southern European countries. It's going to be seen in countries like France, because, well, France had recently a huge worker strike against Amazon, because all these Amazon workers didn't want to work in an Amazon warehouse because they were terrified of getting infected with COVID-19, and who could blame them? One guy got COVID-19 working in an Amazon warehouse, and they said, hey, make the conditions more clean for us, make the sanitary conditions better in order to prevent people from getting infected. Their demands weren't met. And so people went on strike, workers went on strike, and expect to see people in France come up and say things like, why are we, the French people, enslaved to big American multinational corporations? Why are we enslaved to this globalist government? Why can't we have a cottage industry? Why can't we have a country where French people can be for France and not be slaves to a government that does not care about them, to be slaves to a globalization that does not care about them, to be slaves to the Americans who simply want to enslave the French? Why are we allowing our people to be enslaved to multinational, capitalist, fascist corporations? You are going to see more and more rhetoric like that, just as we saw in the Yellow Vest movement in France from 2018 all the way up to early 2020. And you're going to be seeing this sort of thing in Germany. Because Germany, and this is what the economists in Germany have been saying, Germany is going to go through a recession. And so when you have a recession, what are you going to see? You're going to see people blaming immigrants, people blaming migrants, people blaming globalization. The one major geopolitical effect that we are going to see as a result of COVID-19 is an increase in intensification of global hatred towards globalization, towards the current globalist establishment. And people are going to turn more to nationalism. That is one thing that we can expect. Anyway, I think I've talked too much for this video. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.